The bells had not even finished ringing when Evelyn Hart felt her hands go cold inside her white gloves. She stood at the front of the old stone cathedral, her wedding gown heavy against her legs, 300 guests behind her, and a man beside her she suddenly could not recognize. Edmund Vaughn was smiling at the crowd, calm and polished, the way he always was in public. But when the officiant asked him to take her hand, Edmund turned his head for 1 second toward the second row, toward her father, and gave him a small, satisfied nod. It was such a tiny movement. Most people in that cathedral would never have noticed it, but Evelyn saw it, and in that instant something inside her chest cracked open. That nod was not love. It was a signal between two men closing a deal. It was her father, Charles Hart, confirming that the sale had gone through, that his daughter now belonged to the Vaughn family name and the Vaughn family fortune, and that the merger of two shipping empires was finally complete. Evelyn's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The officiant was still speaking, asking her to repeat her vows, but his words sounded far away, like they were coming through water. She looked down at the ring in Edmund's hand, a ring he had chosen without asking her opinion, just as he had chosen everything else about their wedding, their future home, even the color of the flowers that filled the church. She thought of her mother, gone 5 years now, and the promise Evelyn had made to her as a young girl in a small countryside chapel, a promise that she would never let anyone choose her life for her. She had broken that promise slowly, one polite dinner at a time, one signed contract at a time, until she woke up one morning engaged to a man she barely knew. Now, standing at the altar in front of everyone she had ever known, Evelyn understood there would never be a better moment to stop breaking that promise than right now. Her fingers trembled as she let go of Edmund's hand. "Evelyn," Edmund whispered, his smile faltering just slightly, more from confusion than concern. "What are you doing?" She did not answer him. She looked past him, past the officiant, past her father's stunned face, and toward the tall wooden doors at the back of the cathedral, doors that were still slightly open from when the last guest had arrived. Her mind raced. If she said something, if she tried to explain, her father would find a way to talk her back into place, the way he always did. He would remind her of the business, the family name, the years of preparation, and somehow she would nod and agree and turn back to the altar, because that was what she always did. Not this time. Evelyn gathered the front of her gown in both hands, turned and ran. Gasps rippled through the cathedral like a wave. Somewhere behind her she heard her father's voice, sharp and furious, calling her name. She heard Edmund say something to the crowd, trying to laugh it off, trying to control the moment the way he controlled everything. She did not look back. Her heels clicked against the stone floor as she sprinted down the long aisle, past rows of guests in fine suits and elegant dresses, past cousins and business partners and family friends who had traveled from 3 different countries to watch this wedding. Some reached out as if to stop her. She dodged every hand. She burst through the cathedral doors and into the bright afternoon light, the sudden noise of the city hitting her like a wall, cars, pigeons, distant laughter from a nearby cafe, all of it so ordinary and so strange after the heavy silence of the church. Evelyn did not stop running. She pulled the pins from her veil as she went, letting it fall somewhere on the marble steps behind her, not caring who picked it up. Her gown was not made for running, and twice she nearly tripped over the long train, but she kept moving, cutting through a side alley, past a flower cart, past a startled group of tourists taking photographs. Her mind was empty of everything except one thought, one place. The old chapel. It was a small stone building on the edge of the countryside, hours from the cathedral where she had almost said her vows, a place her mother used to take her when Evelyn was still a little girl. They would sit together on the worn wooden pew nearest the window, and her mother would tell her that no matter what happened in life, no matter what anyone tried to make her become, that chapel would always be a place where she could simply be herself. After her mother passed, Evelyn had gone there only a few times, always quietly, always alone, always careful that her father never learned of it. It was the one place in the world that belonged entirely to her, untouched by business deals and family expectations. She hailed a taxi 2 streets from the cathedral, climbing into the back seat still in her wedding gown, her chest heaving from the run. The driver turned around, eyes wide. "Miss, are you all right?" "I need to go to Ashwood Lane," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but firm. "Past the old mill at the edge of town. Please, as fast as you can." The driver did not ask any more questions. Perhaps he had seen enough strange things in his years driving through the city to know when a person needed silence more than conversation. He pulled away from the curb just as Evelyn caught a glimpse, through the back window, of a group of guests spilling out of the cathedral doors, searching the street. She sank low in her seat and closed her eyes, willing the taxi to move faster. The drive felt endless. The city slowly gave way to open fields, gray stone walls, and old oak trees that lined the narrow country road. Evelyn watched it all pass by in a blur, her mind replaying the wedding over and over, the cold nod between her father and Edmund, the moment she had let go of his hand, the sound of her own name being called behind her as she ran. She felt no regret, only a strange, trembling relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. Her phone buzzed in the small bag tied to her wrist. She had almost forgotten she brought it. She looked down and saw 7 missed calls from her father and 3 messages from Edmund, each one more urgent than the last. She turned the phone off without reading them and pushed it deep into her bag. Whatever came next, she was not ready to face it yet. First, she needed to breathe. First, she needed the chapel. As the taxi turned onto Ashwood Lane, Evelyn felt her chest tighten with a different kind of nervousness, something closer to hope than fear. The narrow dirt road was lined with wildflowers, and in the distance, she could see the small stone chapel sitting quietly among the trees, exactly as she remembered it. "This is close enough," she told the driver, and stepped out onto the grass before the car had fully stopped, her gown catching on a low branch as she walked toward the chapel doors. She paid the driver with cash she had tucked into her shoe that morning, a habit her mother had taught her long ago. Always carry something of your own, something no one else controls. The driver gave her one last worried look before pulling away, leaving her alone on the quiet lane. For a moment, Evelyn simply stood there, breathing in the smell of grass and old stone, letting the silence settle over her like a blanket. The chapel looked smaller than she remembered, its wooden door faded and slightly crooked, its small windows covered in a thin layer of dust. But to her, it still felt like the safest place in the world. She reached for the door handle, expecting to find it locked, the way it usually was. Instead, it gave way easily under her hand, swinging open with a soft creak. And that was when she realized she was not alone. Someone was already inside. Evelyn froze in the doorway, her heart leaping into her throat. For one terrifying second, she thought her father had somehow guessed where she would go, that Edmund had sent someone ahead to bring her back before she could even catch her breath. But the figure sitting quietly on the front pew was not one of her father's men. It was a tall man in a dark gray coat, his back to her, his head slightly bowed as if in thought. At the sound of the door, he turned, and Evelyn found herself looking into a pair of calm, gray eyes she recognized but could not quite place. He stood slowly, clearly as surprised to see her as she was to see him. His gaze moved from her tear-streaked face down to the wedding gown still clinging to her frame, and understanding flickered across his expression, quiet and careful, without judgment. "Miss Hart," he said gently, "I did not expect to find you here, especially not like this." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the memory clicked into place. She had met this man only once before, months ago, at a charity gala her father had insisted she attend. He was Alexander Blackwood, a duke from one of the oldest families in the country, a man who kept mostly to himself and rarely appeared in the same social circles as her father. She remembered speaking with him only briefly that night, a short conversation about nothing important, yet something about it had stayed with her long after the evening ended, the way he had actually listened when she spoke, the way he had not once glanced past her shoulder searching for someone more important to talk to. Now here he was, standing in the one place she thought belonged only to her, watching her with an expression that held no trace of shock or scandal, only quiet concern. "Your Grace," Evelyn managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know anyone else came here." Alexander offered her a small, careful smile, the kind that seemed to understand more than it said. "It seems today of all days, we both needed the same quiet place." Evelyn looked down at herself, suddenly aware of how strange she must look, standing in a doorway in a wedding gown with no veil, no husband, no explanation. She felt a fresh wave of panic rise inside her, the reality of what she had just done finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her this far. "I should not be here," she said quickly, stepping back toward the door. "I am sorry to disturb you. I will go somewhere else." "Wait," Alexander said, his voice steady but not commanding, nothing like the tone she was used to hearing from the men in her life. "You do not have to explain anything to me, but you also do not have to leave. This chapel is big enough for two people who both need somewhere quiet today." Evelyn hesitated at the door, one hand still resting on the old wood. Outside, the world was chaos, her father's fury, Edmund's confusion, the scandal that would soon spread through every newspaper in the city. Inside, there was only silence, dust, soft afternoon light through old glass windows, and a man who was, for reasons she could not explain, not asking her a single question she was not ready to answer. Slowly, she let go of the door and stepped further into the chapel, the sound of it closing behind her feeling less like a trap and more like the first safe breath she had taken all day. She did not know yet what this strange, unexpected meeting would mean for the rest of her life. She only knew that for the first time in years, she had made a choice entirely her own, and whatever came next, she intended to keep making choices that belonged to her and no one else. Alexander gestured toward the pew across from where he had been sitting, and Evelyn lowered herself onto it slowly, the fabric of her gown pooling around her like fallen snow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving softly through the trees outside and the faint creak of old wood settling under their weight. She studied him from the corner of her eye. He did not look like a man who had come to a chapel to escape a scandal of his own, yet there was something quiet and heavy in the way he held himself, something she recognized because she felt it too. "You said you needed a quiet place today as well," Evelyn finally said, her voice steadier now. "May I ask why?" Alexander glanced toward the small stone altar at the front of the chapel, his expression softening into something distant and sad. "Today is the anniversary of my mother's passing," he said. "She used to bring me here when I was young, before my family inherited the title, before any of the responsibilities that came with it. She always said this was the one place where titles did not matter." Evelyn's breath caught. "My mother used to say almost the exact same thing." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time that day. "Did she bring you here often?" "When I was a child, yes. After she passed, I came alone, whenever I could slip away without my father noticing." Evelyn's fingers twisted the fabric of her gown. "I never imagined I would meet anyone else here who understood what this place means." The coincidence hung between them, strange and quiet, neither of them quite ready to call it fate, yet both feeling the weight of it all the same. Outside, a bird called out somewhere in the trees, and the late afternoon light shifted slightly through the dusty windows, painting soft gold patterns across the stone floor. "I imagine," Alexander said carefully, "that something significant happened today for you to arrive here in such a state." Evelyn let out a small, humorless laugh. That is one way to describe it. She did not owe him an explanation. She barely knew him. And yet something about the stillness of the chapel, the honesty already hanging in the air between them, made the words come easier than she expected. "I was supposed to be married this afternoon," she said quietly. "To a man my father chose for me, a business arrangement disguised as a romance. I stood at the altar and I realized I could not go through with it, so I ran." She waited for judgment, for the polite shock most people in her world would offer, the kind that hid disapproval behind careful words. Instead, Alexander simply nodded, as if her explanation made perfect sense. "That takes a great deal of courage," he said, "more than most people have." "It does not feel like courage," Evelyn admitted. "It feels like I have destroyed everything. My father will never forgive this. The newspapers will have my name printed by tomorrow morning. Edmund's family will be humiliated, and mine will be ruined." "Perhaps," Alexander said, "or perhaps it simply means you have chosen honesty over comfort, which is rarely easy and rarely without cost." Evelyn studied him again, trying to understand why a duke, a man with his own share of family expectations and public reputation to protect, would speak so calmly about a scandal that most people in their circle would consider disgraceful. "You do not seem surprised by any of this," she said. "Most people would already be thinking of how quickly they could distance themselves from me." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "I have had my own experience with family expectations, Miss Hart. My father spent years trying to arrange a marriage for me with a woman I had met only twice, purely because her family's estate bordered ours. I refused more than once, and it cost me a great deal of peace within my own household. I understand, perhaps better than you realize, what it means to be asked to trade your own life for someone else's plans." Something in Evelyn's chest loosened slightly at his words, a small, unexpected relief at being understood rather than judged. For months, she had felt entirely alone in her resistance to her father's plans, as if she were the only person in her world who found the idea of a loveless, arranged marriage unbearable. Hearing that someone else, someone with far more social standing to lose, had faced a similar battle and refused to bend, gave her a strange sense of steadiness. "How did you manage to refuse?" she asked. "My father has spent my entire life preparing me to be exactly what he needed me to be. I do not think I know how to want anything for myself." Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "I did not manage it easily or quickly. It took years of quiet refusal, disappointing people I cared about, and accepting that my father's anger, while difficult, was not something I could allow to control my choices forever. It also took finding the things that mattered to me outside of my family's expectations, and holding onto them tightly enough that no one could take them away." "What things?" Evelyn asked, genuinely curious now. "This chapel for one," Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Long walks through the countryside my mother loved. Books my father considered a waste of a duke's time. Small things, perhaps, but they were mine, and no one could argue me out of them." Evelyn found herself smiling too, the first real smile she had allowed herself all day. "I do not think I have anything like that. My entire life has been arranged around what benefits the family business, the family name, the family reputation. I do not even know what I would choose for myself, if given the chance." "Then perhaps," Alexander said gently, "today is the beginning of finding out." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold walk. For the first time since she had turned away from the altar, Evelyn did not feel only fear and panic. She felt, faintly, the stirrings of something like possibility. They talked for a long while after that, the conversation moving slowly from careful, guarded topics to easier, more honest ones. Alexander told her about his estate in the countryside, how he preferred the quiet company of his horses and his old library to the noise of society gatherings. Evelyn told him about her mother, how she used to paint small watercolor pictures of the chapel garden, pictures Evelyn still kept hidden in a drawer at home, away from her father's disapproving eyes. She told him about growing up as the only child of a man who valued success over affection, how she had spent years trying to earn a kindness from her father that never quite arrived, no matter how perfectly she followed his plans for her life. Alexander listened without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort, simply present in a way that felt rare and important. As the afternoon faded into early evening, golden light gave way to soft blue shadows inside the chapel. Evelyn realized with some surprise that she had not thought once about the chaos waiting for her outside these walls, not the reporters who would soon be searching for her, not her father's fury, not Edmund's wounded pride. For a few hours, she had simply existed as herself, without any title or expectation attached to her name. "I should probably think about what comes next," she said eventually, glancing toward the small chapel windows, now dark with the coming night. "I cannot hide here forever." "No," Alexander agreed. "But you also do not have to face whatever comes next entirely alone, unless that is truly what you want." Evelyn looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the same calculation she had seen so often in Edmund's expression, any hint that his kindness came with hidden conditions or expectations. She found none. "Why would you want to involve yourself in my scandal?" she asked honestly. "You barely know me, and whatever help you offer will likely draw attention to you as well, attention I imagine you have spent years trying to avoid." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Perhaps because I understand what it costs to choose honesty over comfort, and I would not wish anyone to face that cost entirely alone. Or perhaps," he added, a faint, warmer smile crossing his face, "because in all my years attending tedious social gatherings, you are the first person I have met who spoke to me as though I were simply a person, rather than a title. I have not forgotten that conversation from the gala, even after all these months." Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with fear or panic. "I remember that conversation too," she admitted quietly. "It was the only part of that entire evening I actually enjoyed." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees surrounding the chapel. Somewhere in the distance, faint and far away, Evelyn thought she heard the low hum of a car engine, and her chest tightened instinctively. "They will start searching here eventually," she said. "This was always the first place I would run to if anyone truly knew me at all." Alexander stood, offering her his hand to help her rise from the pew. "Then we should not wait for them to find you unprepared. My estate is a short distance from here, quiet, private, and far from the kind of attention currently searching the city for you. You are welcome to stay there while you decide what you want to do next, with no expectations and no conditions." Evelyn hesitated, staring at his outstretched hand. Trusting a stranger, even one who had shown her nothing but understanding in the past few hours, felt like a significant risk after a lifetime of learning that kindness often hid other motives. But staying here, waiting to be found by her father's men or worse, by reporters eager for a scandal, felt like an even greater risk. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not asking me to explain myself more than I was ready to." "You do not owe anyone an explanation for choosing honesty," Alexander replied, helping her to her feet. "Not your father, not Edmund's family, and certainly not me." Together, they stepped out of the small chapel and into the cool evening air, the first stars beginning to appear faintly overhead. Evelyn glanced back once at the old stone building, the place that had always been her refuge, and felt a quiet gratitude that today it had offered her something even greater than solitude. It had offered her the beginning of an unexpected alliance, with a man who, for reasons she was only just beginning to understand, felt less like a stranger with every passing hour. As they walked toward the narrow country road where his car waited, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that whatever waited for her beyond this quiet lane, whatever storm was already brewing back in the city, she would not be facing it in the same way she had faced everything else in her life. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not walking toward someone else's plan for her future. She was walking toward her own. The car ride to Alexander's estate was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that did not feel uncomfortable, only necessary. Evelyn watched the countryside slide past the window, dark fields and distant farmhouses lit by warm yellow windows, and tried to steady the storm of thoughts still spinning through her mind. She kept expecting to feel regret. She kept waiting for the moment when the full weight of what she had done would crash down on her and make her beg the driver to turn the car around, back toward the cathedral, back toward an apology she could offer her father, back toward the safe, predictable life she had always known. The moment never came. Instead, with every mile that passed, she felt lighter, as though she had been carrying a stone in her chest for years without realizing it, and had only now set it down. Alexander's estate appeared at the end of a long gravel drive lined with tall, old trees, their branches forming a quiet tunnel that opened suddenly onto a wide, elegant house built from pale gray stone. Warm light glowed from several of the windows, and as the car pulled to a stop, a pair of large wooden doors opened, revealing an older woman in a neat dark dress who hurried down the front steps with clear concern on her face. "Your Grace," the woman said, glancing quickly between Alexander and Evelyn, taking in the wedding gown with wide, careful eyes. "I did not expect you back so soon or with a guest." "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Miss Hart," Alexander said calmly, stepping out of the car and offering his hand to help Evelyn out as well. "She will be staying with us for a while. Please prepare the guest room in the east wing, and perhaps something warm for her to wear this evening." Mrs. Whitfield's expression shifted quickly from surprise into brisk, practical efficiency, the kind Evelyn recognized from long years of watching household staff manage sudden, complicated situations without asking too many questions. "Of course, Your Grace. Right away." As Mrs. Whitfield hurried back inside, Evelyn turned to Alexander, still standing at the bottom of the front steps in her wedding gown, feeling suddenly very aware of how strange and vulnerable she must look. "Your staff must think I am either running from the law or losing my mind." "Mrs. Whitfield has worked for my family for over 20 years, Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She has seen far stranger things than a woman arriving unannounced in a wedding gown. She will ask no questions unless you wish to answer them." Inside, the house was warm and quiet, filled with the soft glow of lamplight and the smell of old wood and fresh flowers. Evelyn followed Alexander through a wide entrance hall lined with paintings, up a curving staircase, and into a bright, comfortable guest room where a fire had already been lit in the small stone fireplace. "Take whatever time you need," Alexander said, pausing in the doorway. "There is no rush here and no expectation. If you would like dinner or simply rest, either is entirely your choice." Evelyn looked around the room, so different from the carefully decorated, impersonal guest rooms of her father's house, filled instead with worn, comfortable furniture and shelves of well-read books. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." "You do not need to repay it," Alexander said simply. "Rest well, Miss Hart." After he left, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, still in her wedding gown, staring at her own hands as though they belonged to someone else. Slowly, the reality of the day began to settle over her, not as panic this time, but as a quiet, overwhelming exhaustion. She had run from her own wedding. She had left 300 guests, a furious father and a humiliated fiancé behind her. And somehow, impossibly, she had found herself here, in the home of a duke she barely knew, safe and warm, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely free. She changed out of the wedding gown into the simple, soft clothing Mrs. Whitfield had left for her, folding the gown carefully and setting it aside, unsure if she ever wanted to see it again. Then, exhausted beyond words, she climbed into the unfamiliar bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first peaceful sleep she had experienced in months. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the curtains, and the distant sound of birds singing outside her window. For a brief, disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, forgot everything that had happened the day before. Then it all came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. A soft knock came at the door. "Miss Hart," Mrs. Whitfield's voice called gently. "His Grace asked me to let you know breakfast is ready whenever you are. There is also something you may wish to see when you are ready." Evelyn dressed quickly in the clothing left for her, a simple green dress that fit surprisingly well, and made her way downstairs, following the smell of fresh bread and coffee to a bright, sunlit dining room where Alexander was already seated, a newspaper folded beside his plate. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his eyes told her the news was not good. "Good morning," he said, standing briefly as she took her seat. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Evelyn admitted, glancing toward the folded newspaper beside his plate. "What is it you wanted me to see?" Alexander hesitated for a moment before sliding the newspaper across the table toward her. Evelyn's breath caught as she saw the front page, a large photograph of her running down the cathedral steps in her wedding gown, veil trailing behind her, captured in the exact moment of her escape. The headline above it read in bold black letters, "Heart Heiress Flees Wedding Moments Before Vows, Whereabouts Unknown." Her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the article beneath it, filled with speculation about her disappearance, quotes from unnamed guests describing the shock and confusion at the cathedral, and a brief, carefully worded statement from her father expressing concern for her well-being that felt, to Evelyn, more like damage control than genuine worry. "They make it sound like I have vanished into thin air," she said quietly, setting the newspaper down. "My father must be furious." "There is more," Alexander said carefully. "Edmund Vaughn gave an interview late last night. He claims you suffered from what he called wedding day nerves, and expressed hope that you would return safely so the ceremony could be rescheduled." Evelyn felt anger flare hot and sudden in her chest, sharper than any fear she had felt the day before. "He is already trying to control the story, making it sound as though I simply panicked, rather than made a deliberate choice to leave a marriage I never wanted." "That does not surprise me," Alexander said. "Men like Edmund rarely allow their public image to reflect reality, especially when reality does not flatter them." Evelyn pushed the newspaper away, her appetite for breakfast suddenly gone. "What happens now? My father will not simply let this go. He has spent years building this alliance with the Vaughn family, and I have just destroyed it in front of everyone he answers to." "What happens now," Alexander said gently, "is entirely up to you. You are welcome to stay here as long as you need, away from the attention this story will bring. But eventually, you will need to decide how you wish to respond, if at all, and what kind of life you want to build once the noise settles." Evelyn stared out the tall dining room windows, toward the quiet green fields stretching beyond the estate, so different from the chaos she imagined was currently unfolding back in the city. Reporters would be gathering outside her father's house. Business partners would be asking uncomfortable questions. And somewhere, her father would be pacing his study, furious and humiliated, already plotting how best to salvage what remained of his carefully constructed plans. "I am not ready to face any of that yet," she admitted quietly. "Is it terrible of me to want to simply stay here a while longer, away from all of it?" "It is not terrible at all," Alexander said. "Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is give themselves time to breathe before facing what comes next." Over the following days, Evelyn settled into a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm at the estate, one entirely different from the carefully scheduled life she had always known. She woke without an assistant reminding her of appointments, ate meals without her father watching to ensure she represented the family properly, and spent long afternoons wandering the estate's gardens and libraries without anyone questioning how she chose to spend her time. She and Alexander fell into an easy companionship, sharing meals together, talking late into the evenings about everything and nothing, from childhood memories to half-formed dreams neither of them had ever spoken aloud before. Evelyn found herself laughing more in those few days than she had in the past several years combined, a genuine, unguarded laughter that surprised her every time it escaped. She also found herself watching Alexander more closely than she probably should have, noticing the careful, patient way he listened when she spoke, the quiet respect in the way he never once pushed her to explain more than she was ready to share, the small, warm smile that appeared whenever she said something that genuinely amused him. It frightened her slightly, how quickly she had come to look forward to his company, how natural it felt to sit beside him in the evenings, watching the fire crackle in the study while they talked about books they both loved. But even as the days at the estate brought her a peace she had not known in years, Evelyn could not ignore the growing unease building somewhere in the back of her mind. Her father was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. And the longer she stayed hidden away, safe within Alexander's quiet countryside estate, the more certain she became that this fragile peace would not last much longer. She was right to worry. On the 5th morning of her stay, as Evelyn sat in the estate's sunlit library reading one of Alexander's worn old novels, Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with concern. "Miss Hart," she said carefully, "there is a car approaching the front gate. His Grace asked me to let you know immediately." Evelyn's stomach dropped as she set the book aside and rose quickly to her feet, her heart already pounding with the familiar dread of knowing exactly whose car it likely was. Her father had found her. Evelyn rushed to the tall front windows of the library, her hands pressed against the cool glass as she watched a familiar black car roll slowly up the long gravel drive. She would have recognized that car anywhere, the same one that had carried her to countless business dinners and social events her entire life, always driven by the same quiet, careful driver who worked for her father. "It is him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how he found this place." Alexander appeared beside her at the window, his expression calm but alert. "It is not difficult to guess, if he learned we spoke together at the gala months ago. Society circles are smaller than most people realize, and news travels quickly among them." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as the car came to a stop in front of the estate, and her father stepped out, straightening his coat with the same sharp, controlled movement she had watched her entire life. Even from this distance, she could see the tight set of his jaw, the barely restrained fury simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "I should speak with him," Evelyn said, though the words felt heavier than she expected as she spoke them. "Hiding will not solve anything. He will only grow more determined." "You do not have to face him alone," Alexander said quietly. "Whatever you decide, I will stand beside you." Evelyn looked at him, surprised by how much comfort those simple words offered. She nodded, took a steadying breath, and together they made their way down to the entrance hall, arriving just as Mrs. Whitfield opened the front door to reveal Charles Hart standing on the front steps, his expression a careful mask that did nothing to hide the anger simmering underneath. "Evelyn," her father said, his voice tight and controlled, the same tone he used in business meetings when he was working very hard to appear calm. "I have been searching for you for 5 days. Do you have any idea what you have done?" "I know exactly what I have done, father," Evelyn said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I refused to marry a man I do not love, in a wedding arranged entirely for the benefit of your business." Her father's eyes flicked briefly toward Alexander, standing quietly beside her, before returning to Evelyn with renewed sharpness. "And I see you did not run far, or alone. Do you understand what this looks like, disappearing from your own wedding only to be discovered days later at the home of a duke?" Heat rushed to Evelyn's cheeks, but she refused to let the accusation shake her. "It looks like exactly what it is. I fled a marriage I never chose and found refuge with someone who has shown me more genuine respect in 5 days than you and Edmund managed in 5 years. "Respect," her father repeated, his voice sharpening with disbelief. "Do you understand what you have cost this family? The Vaughan merger is finished. Edmund's father is threatening legal action over the humiliation. Our business partners are questioning whether the Hart name can still be trusted." "None of that was ever about me," Evelyn said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "It was about contracts and mergers and reputations. You never once asked whether I wanted to marry Edmund. You simply informed me that I would." Her father's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered across his face that almost resembled genuine hurt, quickly buried beneath renewed anger. "I have spent my entire life building something to give you, Evelyn. A secure future, a respected name, opportunities most people could never dream of. Everything I have done has been to ensure you would never struggle the way I did as a young man." "I understand that you believe that," Evelyn said quietly. "But you built a future I never asked for and never wanted. A secure life without love is not the gift you believe it to be." Alexander stepped slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Hart, whatever disagreements exist between you and your daughter, I would ask that you remember she is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions about her own life. She came to my home seeking only quiet and safety, nothing more. Charles Hart's gaze snapped toward Alexander, sharp and assessing. And what exactly is your interest in my daughter's decisions, Your Grace? Forgive me if I find it difficult to believe a duke offers shelter to a runaway bride out of simple kindness, with no benefit to himself. Believe whatever you wish, Alexander replied evenly. But I assure you, my only interest has been ensuring Miss Hart had somewhere safe to gather her thoughts, away from the pressure currently surrounding her in the city. For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down first. Evelyn watched, her heart pounding, torn between gratitude for Alexander's steady support and fear of what her father might do in response to being challenged so directly, something that rarely happened to him in any setting. Evelyn, her father said finally, turning back to her, his tone shifting into something more measured, more calculated, the tone he used when trying a different strategy after the first had failed. Come home with me. We can still repair this. I have already spoken with Edmund's father, and there is still a path forward if you are willing to apologize publicly and reschedule the ceremony. No, Evelyn said, the word coming out clearer and more certain than she expected. I am not going to marry Edmund, father. Not now, not ever. I am sorry for the embarrassment this has caused you, truly. But I will not spend the rest of my life trapped in a marriage built entirely on business, simply to protect your reputation. Her father's expression hardened into something colder than Evelyn had ever seen directed at her before. If you refuse to return home and correct this situation, do not expect the family's support to continue. Your allowance, your access to the family accounts, your place in this household, all of it depends on your cooperation. Evelyn felt the threat land exactly as her father intended, a cold, familiar tightening in her chest. For years, that threat alone would have been enough to bend her will, to send her home with quiet, obedient apologies. But standing here now, in the doorway of a home that had shown her more warmth in 5 days than her father's house had in years, she found she was no longer as afraid of losing those things as he expected her to be. Then I will manage without it, she said quietly, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of what she was giving up. I would rather have nothing and choose my own life than have everything and continue living someone else's plan for me. Her father stared at her for a long moment, clearly unprepared for her refusal to bend under the pressure he had relied on her entire life to control. Something flickered across his face, disbelief perhaps, or the first uncomfortable stirrings of genuine loss, quickly hidden again behind cold composure. You will regret this decision, he said finally, turning back toward his waiting car. When the money runs out, when society turns its back on you, when you realize exactly how difficult the world is without the protection of the Hart name, do not expect me to simply welcome you back. I do not expect that, Evelyn said softly, watching him walk away. I only hope that someday you will understand why I could not stay. Her father did not respond. He climbed into his car without another word, and Evelyn watched the familiar black vehicle disappear back down the long gravel drive, carrying away the last certain, secure future she had ever known. For a long moment after the car vanished from sight, Evelyn simply stood in the doorway, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alexander remained quietly beside her, not speaking, simply present, allowing her the space to process what had just happened without pressure or expectation. I have never spoken to him like that before, she finally said, her voice unsteady. In my entire life, I have never refused him so directly. How does it feel? Alexander asked gently. Evelyn considered the question honestly, searching past the fear and grief still tangled in her chest for something else, something quieter underneath. Terrifying, she admitted. And also, somehow, like the first time I have ever truly stood on my own. Alexander offered her a small, warm smile. That sounds like an excellent place to begin. Evelyn turned to look at him, this man who had, in the span of 5 short days, become an unexpected anchor in the middle of the greatest storm of her life. She did not yet know what the future held without her father's support, without the secure, predictable life she had always known. But standing here now, beside someone who had chosen to stand firmly by her side rather than pressure her into retreat, she felt something she had not expected to feel so soon after losing nearly everything. She felt hope. The days following her father's visit brought a different kind of storm, one that Evelyn had not fully prepared herself for. By the end of that same week, photographers had discovered the location of Alexander's estate, and a small cluster of cars began gathering just beyond the front gate each morning, cameras ready, waiting for any glimpse of the runaway bride who had apparently found refuge with a duke. Evelyn watched from an upstairs window one afternoon as Mrs. Whitfield argued with a persistent reporter who had climbed halfway up the front wall trying to get a better photograph, and felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over her. "I am sorry," she said later that evening, finding Alexander in his study, staring at a stack of newspapers Mrs. Whitfield had reluctantly brought inside. "I never intended to bring this kind of attention to your home." Alexander looked up, setting the newspapers aside. "You have nothing to apologize for. This attention exists because of the choices your father and Edmund made public, not because of anything you have done wrong." Evelyn moved closer, glancing down at the headlines scattered across his desk. One newspaper speculated boldly about a secret romance between the runaway bride and the reclusive duke. Another quoted an anonymous source close to the Hart family, suggesting Evelyn had always planned to leave Edmund for someone with a grander title. A third included a photograph of Edmund himself, looking appropriately wounded for the cameras, alongside a quote expressing his continued hope that Evelyn would return home once she came to her senses. "He makes it sound as though I am confused rather than certain," Evelyn said, anger flaring again at the familiar frustration of watching Edmund control the narrative from a distance. "Edmund has always been skilled at managing public perception," Alexander said. "It is, unfortunately, one of his more notable talents." As if summoned by the mere mention of his name, Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the study doorway moments later, her expression tight with obvious discomfort. "Your Grace, Miss Hart, there is a gentleman at the front gate requesting to speak with Miss Hart directly. He says his name is Edmund Vaughn." Evelyn's stomach dropped, a cold, familiar dread spreading through her chest. She had not spoken with Edmund since the moment she let go of his hand at the altar, and the thought of facing him now, after everything that had happened, filled her with an anxiety she had not expected to feel this strongly. "You do not have to see him," Alexander said quietly, watching her carefully. "You are under no obligation to speak with anyone who arrives uninvited." Evelyn considered the offer for a long moment, torn between the instinct to hide away and a growing understanding that avoiding Edmund forever was neither realistic nor, perhaps, entirely healthy. Eventually, some conversation between them would need to happen, and delaying it further would only prolong the uncertainty hanging over her. "I will see him," she said finally, "but not alone." Alexander nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "Then we will see him together." They met Edmund in the estate's formal sitting room rather than allowing him further into the house, a small but deliberate choice Evelyn made to establish some measure of control over the encounter. Edmund entered looking exactly as polished and composed as he always did, his expensive coat perfectly tailored, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern, though Evelyn had learned long ago how little that expression actually reflected his real feelings. "Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "you look well considering everything." "Edmund," she replied evenly, not offering him a seat, standing instead beside Alexander near the tall windows. "Why have you come?" Edmund's gaze flicked briefly toward Alexander before returning to Evelyn, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "I came because I believe we still have things to discuss. The wedding may have been interrupted, but the arrangement between our families remains, and I think it is time we spoke honestly about moving forward." "There is no arrangement to move forward with," Evelyn said. "I made that clear when I left the cathedral." You made a dramatic gesture, Edmund countered, his composed tone slipping slightly, revealing a thread of frustration beneath it. Wedding day nerves are common, Evelyn. I have been quite understanding about the entire situation publicly, but privately, I think it is time you returned home, and we resumed our plans quietly, before this becomes an even greater embarrassment than it already is. Evelyn felt her jaw tighten at the dismissive way he described her decision, reducing her deliberate, carefully considered choice to something as trivial as nerves. This was not nerves, Edmund. I do not love you. I never have. Our marriage was arranged for the benefit of our father's businesses, and I no longer wish to be part of that arrangement. Edmund's composed mask slipped further, something colder and more calculating showing through underneath. Do you understand what you are throwing away? My family, your family, the merger, the social standing that comes with our union. And for what exactly? A few days of freedom at a duke's estate, before reality sets in and you realize how difficult life becomes without the protection of a respected family name. I would rather face that difficulty honestly, Evelyn said, than spend my life pretending to love a man who has never once asked what I actually want. Edmund's gaze shifted again toward Alexander, sharper this time, more openly hostile. And is this the reason for your sudden clarity, Your Grace? I find it remarkable how quickly Evelyn discovered her true feelings, once safely tucked away in your home. Careful, Vaughn, Alexander said, his voice low and controlled, though something firm and unmistakable had entered it. Miss Hart's decision was made before she ever arrived at my home, and it was hers alone to make. I would suggest you direct your frustration toward the arrangement itself, rather than searching for someone else to blame for its failure. Edmund's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond further, his phone buzzed sharply in his coat pocket. He glanced at it, his expression flickering with something like irritation, before returning his attention to Evelyn. "This is not finished," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "My father has already begun exploring legal options regarding the broken engagement contract, and I imagine your father will be equally interested in pursuing whatever damages he believes are owed. You may believe you have escaped something today, Evelyn, but I promise you, the consequences of this decision are only beginning." He turned sharply and left the room without another word, his expensive shoes clicking rapidly against the polished floor as he made his way back toward the front entrance. Evelyn stood frozen for a long moment after the sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, her heart pounding, the threat of legal consequences settling heavily over her already fragile sense of newfound freedom. "He is not wrong to threaten legal action," she said quietly, sinking onto the nearest chair. "There was an engagement contract drafted by both families' lawyers. I do not fully understand the details, but I know it included financial penalties for either party breaking the arrangement." Alexander moved to sit beside her, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Contracts of that nature exist in many arranged marriages among families like ours, but they are rarely as ironclad as they appear, particularly when a marriage was never legally completed. I would encourage you to seek proper legal counsel before assuming the worst. "I do not have the resources to hire proper legal counsel," Evelyn admitted, the reality of her situation settling over her with fresh weight. "My father has already threatened to cut off my access to family accounts. I have very little money of my own, nothing beyond what I managed to save privately over the years." "You do not need to worry about that," Alexander said gently. "I am more than capable of ensuring you have access to whatever legal support you require, without any expectation attached to that offer." Evelyn looked at him, torn between gratitude and a deep discomfort at the idea of becoming dependent on another person's generosity so soon after fleeing a life defined entirely by other people's control over her choices. "I do not want to trade one dependence for another, Alexander. I left Edmund because I refused to live a life where my security depended entirely on someone else's goodwill." "This is different," Alexander said carefully. "I am not offering you security in exchange for anything, Evelyn. I am offering you support freely, because I believe in the choice you made. and I do not wish to see you forced back into a life you fought so hard to escape simply because of financial pressure." Evelyn considered his words for a long moment, searching them for any hidden expectation, any quiet condition she had learned to look for after a lifetime of transactional relationships. She found none, only the same steady, genuine kindness he had shown her since the moment she first stumbled into the chapel 5 days earlier. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I will accept your help on the condition that I find some way to build my own independence as quickly as possible. I do not wish to rely on anyone's generosity indefinitely, not even yours." "That seems a reasonable condition," Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And knowing you as I have come to these past days, I have no doubt you will manage it far sooner than you expect." Despite the fresh uncertainty of legal threats and an uncertain financial future, Evelyn found herself feeling steadier than she had in the immediate aftermath of Edmund's visit, grounded by Alexander's calm, unwavering support. The path ahead remained unclear, filled with challenges she had never before faced alone, but for the first time, she felt genuinely prepared to face them, rather than simply enduring whatever life arranged around her. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn wandered down to the estate's quiet library, finding Alexander already there, seated near the fireplace with a book resting unread in his lap, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Could not sleep either," she asked softly, settling into the chair across from him. "Too much on my mind," he admitted. "I find myself worried about what Edmund and your father might attempt next, and equally uncertain how best to protect you from whatever that turns out to be." "You have already done more than I ever expected," Evelyn said. "I do not think you need to carry this worry alone." Alexander looked at her, something warm and unguarded crossing his expression in the firelight. "I find, rather unexpectedly, that I do not mind carrying it, if it means ensuring you are safe." The quiet admission hung in the air between them, warm and honest, neither of them quite ready to name what was growing steadily beneath the surface of their unlikely alliance. But sitting there together in the firelight, Evelyn understood with quiet certainty that whatever storms Edmund and her father chose to bring against her, she would not be facing them alone. Over the following weeks, Evelyn's life at the estate settled into something resembling stability, though never quite escaping the underlying tension of the battle still unfolding around her. Alexander arranged for a lawyer, a sharp, patient woman named Margaret Ellery, who reviewed the engagement contract carefully and assured Evelyn that since the marriage had never been legally finalized, the financial penalties Edmund's family threatened were far less certain than they wanted her to believe. "They are attempting to frighten you into compliance," Margaret explained during one of their meetings in Alexander's study, spreading documents carefully across the desk. "Contracts like this rely heavily on both parties believing they have no other choice but to honor them. In reality, the courts rarely enforce such agreements strictly, particularly when no marriage ceremony was actually completed." Evelyn felt a measure of relief at the explanation, though the underlying anxiety of facing her father's and Edmund's combined legal resources never fully disappeared. Still, with each passing week, she found herself growing steadier, more capable of handling the uncertainty without the constant fear that had gripped her in those first difficult days. She began spending her mornings helping Mrs. Whitfield manage correspondence and household accounts, discovering a genuine satisfaction in practical work she had never been allowed to do in her father's house, where such tasks were always handled by hired staff far removed from the family itself. In the afternoons, she wandered the estate's gardens, sometimes with Alexander, sometimes alone, slowly rediscovering small pleasures she had long ago set aside in favor of the carefully scheduled life her father demanded of her. Her relationship with Alexander deepened steadily during this time, growing from careful companionship into something warmer, something neither of them rushed to name but both clearly recognized. They shared quiet dinners filled with easy conversation, long walks through the countryside discussing books and ideas neither had ever felt free to discuss with anyone else, and evenings by the fire where comfortable silence felt just as meaningful as conversation. It was during one such evening, several weeks into her stay, that Alexander's older sister, Charlotte, arrived unannounced at the estate, her sharp eyes taking in the situation with obvious curiosity the moment she stepped through the front door. "Alexander," Charlotte said, embracing her brother briefly before turning her attention immediately to Evelyn, who stood somewhat uncertainly nearby. "I have heard quite a lot about you these past weeks, Miss Hart. The papers have hardly discussed anything else." "Charlotte," Alexander said, a note of warning entering his voice, "be kind." "I am always kind," Charlotte replied, though her expression remained sharply assessing as she studied Evelyn. "I simply prefer honesty alongside my kindness. Tell me, Miss Hart, what exactly are your intentions toward my brother? He has spent years avoiding every eligible woman our family attempted to introduce him to, and suddenly he is sheltering a runaway bride in our family estate. Forgive me if I find that curious." Evelyn felt her cheeks flush, uncertain how to answer a question she had not yet fully answered for herself. "I have no particular intentions, Lady Charlotte. Your brother offered me shelter during an extremely difficult time, nothing more." Charlotte's sharp gaze softened slightly, something more thoughtful replacing the initial suspicion. "Nothing more, him. Alexander, might I speak with you privately for a moment?" The two siblings disappeared into the study, leaving Evelyn standing uncertainly in the entrance hall, her earlier confidence wavering under the weight of Charlotte's pointed questions. She understood the concern, truly. From an outside perspective, her presence at the estate likely appeared far more complicated than the simple friendship she and Alexander had carefully maintained, at least outwardly, despite the growing warmth clearly developing between them. When Alexander emerged from the study some time later, his expression carried a mixture of exasperation and quiet amusement. "My apologies for my sister's directness. She means well, even when her delivery leaves something to be desired." "What did she say?" Evelyn asked, unable to fully hide her curiosity. Alexander hesitated, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She reminded me that our family has faced its own share of public scrutiny over the years, and expressed concern that sheltering you here, however genuine the intention, could bring unwanted complications to both our reputations if handled carelessly." "She is not wrong to worry," Evelyn said quietly. "I have already caused enough disruption to your household. I would not wish to cause further damage to your family's standing." "Charlotte worries about reputation more than most," Alexander said. "But she also reminded me of something else, something I believe holds far more truth than her concerns about public perception." "What is that?" Alexander met her gaze directly, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "She asked whether my feelings toward you extended beyond simple friendship, and rather than answering carefully the way I usually manage such questions, I found myself answering honestly, without hesitation." Evelyn's heart quickened, though she remained still, waiting for him to continue. "I told her yes," Alexander said simply. "That somewhere during these past weeks, my feelings toward you grew into something far deeper than friendship, though I have been hesitant to speak of it, given everything you have already endured these past months." The quiet honesty of his admission settled warmly over Evelyn, chasing away the last of her earlier uncertainty. She had felt the same shift growing steadily within herself these past weeks, a warmth and comfort in Alexander's presence that had nothing to do with gratitude for his shelter, and everything to do with the genuine connection they had built together, built on honesty rather than obligation. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "I have felt it growing for weeks now, though I was equally hesitant to name it, given everything still unresolved in my life." Alexander stepped closer, his expression careful and searching. "I do not wish to rush you into anything, Evelyn, particularly not while you are still navigating the aftermath of everything with your father and Edmund. Whatever grows between us, I want it built on your own timeline, free of any pressure." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said, "more than you know. But I also do not wish to hide from what I feel simply because the timing seems complicated." I have spent my entire life waiting for the right, convenient moment to want things for myself, and I am tired of waiting. The following weeks brought a new, quiet happiness into Evelyn's life at the estate, even as the legal and social complications surrounding her continued unfolding in the background. She and Alexander no longer hid the growing affection between them, though they remained careful and private about it, wary of giving the persistent reporters still occasionally gathered near the front gate any further fuel for their ongoing speculation. Margaret Ellery continued working diligently on the legal front, successfully negotiating a settlement with Edmund's family that required no further financial penalty from Evelyn, largely due to evidence Margaret uncovered suggesting the original engagement contract had been drafted with terms that would not hold up well under closer legal scrutiny. Evelyn's father, meanwhile, remained distant and unyielding, refusing all attempts at reconciliation, his pride still too wounded by the public embarrassment of his daughter's very public departure from the life he had so carefully arranged for her. Despite the ongoing complications, Evelyn found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely content with the direction her life had taken. She had begun exploring small opportunities to build her own independence, as she had promised Alexander she would, taking on part-time work helping catalog and restore old books in the estate's expansive library, work she found unexpectedly fulfilling and entirely her own, free of any family expectation attached to it. One evening, several months after that first strange, unexpected meeting in the small stone chapel, Alexander suggested a walk through the estate's gardens after dinner, the autumn air crisp and cool around them, stars beginning to appear overhead in the darkening sky. "I have been thinking," Alexander said as they walked slowly along the familiar garden path, "about how much has changed since the day you first arrived here, still in your wedding gown, running from a life you never wanted." "So have I," Evelyn admitted, smiling softly at the memory, one that had once felt terrifying and now felt like the beginning of everything good that had followed. "I could never have imagined, standing in that chapel doorway, exactly how much my life would change because of that day." Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her fully, something quietly nervous flickering beneath his usual calm composure. "Evelyn, I know you fled one wedding already, and I would never wish to rush you toward another before you feel entirely ready. But I find myself hoping, more than I have ever hoped for anything, that someday, when the time feels right for both of us, you might consider building a future together, one built entirely on our own choice, rather than anyone else's arrangement." Evelyn felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, warm and grateful rather than sorrowful. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Though I think, when that day comes, I would want it to happen somewhere quiet, somewhere that has always felt entirely my own." Alexander smiled, understanding immediately. "The chapel." "The chapel," Evelyn agreed, laughing softly through her happy tears. "The one place I have always trusted, long before I ever imagined it might also become the place where I found you." They stood together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the future stretching out ahead of them uncertain in its details but entirely certain in its foundation, built not on business arrangements or family expectations, but on genuine choice, freely made, by two people who had each, in their own way, fought hard to claim the right to choose their own lives. The invitation arrived on a cold morning in early winter, delivered by messenger to the estate, along with several others addressed to Alexander. It was for the annual Founders' Gala, a grand charity event held every year in the city, attended by nearly everyone of significance within their social circle, including, Evelyn knew immediately, her father and, quite likely, Edmund Vaughan as well. "You do not have to attend," Alexander said carefully, watching her study the elegant invitation with a troubled expression. "I understand entirely if the thought of facing that crowd again feels like more than you wish to manage right now." Evelyn set the invitation down, considering it for a long moment. Months had passed since she had appeared in public, months spent quietly rebuilding her life away from the scrutiny that had once defined nearly every part of her existence. Part of her wanted nothing more than to remain safely at the estate, away from the curious stares and whispered speculation that would surely follow her the moment she stepped back into that world. But another part of her, a part that had grown steadily stronger these past months, recognized something important in the invitation as well, an opportunity to finally face the world on her own terms, rather than continuing to hide from it indefinitely. "I want to go," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with how certain the words sounded. "I have spent long enough avoiding that world entirely. I think it is time I faced it, not as the frightened runaway bride the papers describe, but as myself, standing beside the choices I have made." Alexander studied her carefully, clearly recognizing the resolve in her decision. "Then I will be there beside you, every step of the evening." The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the grand ballroom where the event was held glowing with warm golden light as elegant guests filled the space, their conversations blending into a low, constant hum beneath the soft music of a small orchestra. Evelyn stood at the entrance in a deep blue gown, far simpler than anything she would have worn to such an event in her old life, yet one that felt entirely, comfortably her own. She felt the shift in the room the moment she and Alexander stepped inside, conversations pausing briefly as heads turned toward them, curious whispers rippling outward like small waves. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, her hand steady on Alexander's arm, refusing to let the attention shake the quiet confidence she had worked so hard to build these past months. They had not been inside the ballroom for more than 20 minutes when Evelyn spotted her father across the room, standing near a group of business associates, his expression tightening the moment his eyes landed on her. Beside him, unmistakable even from a distance, stood Edmund Vaughn, dressed impeccably as always, his gaze equally sharp as it settled on Evelyn and Alexander together. "They have seen us," Evelyn said quietly, her stomach tightening despite her earlier resolve. "Would you like to leave?" Alexander asked gently. Evelyn considered the question, watching her father begin making his way slowly across the room toward them, Edmund following close behind. "No," she said finally. "I think this conversation has been coming for a long time. I would rather face it directly than continue avoiding it." Her father arrived first, his expression carefully controlled in front of the watching crowd, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the tension underneath. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing further attention, though several nearby guests had clearly noticed the tense reunion unfolding. "I did not expect to see you here tonight. I felt it was time I returned to society on my own terms," Evelyn said evenly, rather than continuing to hide from it. Edmund arrived a moment later, his expression carefully arranged into polite civility, though Evelyn could see the sharp calculation still working behind his eyes. "Evelyn, you look well. Married life at the estate must agree with you." His tone carried just enough edge to make the comment feel more like an accusation than a compliment. "I am not married, Edmund," Evelyn said calmly. "Though I understand why you might assume otherwise, given how eagerly the papers have speculated about my private life these past months." A few nearby guests, clearly listening despite pretending otherwise, exchanged quick glances at the tension crackling between the small group. Evelyn felt her heart pounding, but forced herself to remain steady, refusing to let either her father or Edmund see the anxiety still tightening in her chest. "I think," her father said quietly, "that we should discuss this somewhere more private." "I disagree," Evelyn said, surprising even herself with the firmness of her response. "I think whatever needs to be said between us can be said here, plainly, without hiding behind private rooms and careful diplomacy, the way our family always has." Her father's expression flickered with visible discomfort at her refusal to retreat into the private, controlled conversations he had always preferred. "Very well," he said finally, his voice tightening. "I will say plainly, then, that your decision has cost this family greatly, Evelyn. The Vaughn merger collapsed entirely. Several of our longtime business partners have quietly distanced themselves, uncertain whether the Hart name still carries the reliability it once did. I am sorry for the business consequences you have faced," Evelyn said honestly. But I am not sorry for refusing a marriage I never wanted. Those are two separate things, Father, though you have always treated them as one and the same. Edmund stepped forward slightly, his composed mask slipping further under the pressure of the public setting. You make it sound so simple, Evelyn, as though choosing yourself over your family's well-being is some great, noble act, rather than the reckless, selfish decision it actually was. It was not reckless, Alexander said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice carrying a quiet, firm authority that drew the attention of several nearby guests. It was honest. There is a significant difference, though I understand why that distinction might be difficult for either of you to recognize, given how thoroughly your own decisions have always centered around business advantage rather than genuine care for Evelyn's well-being. Edmund's jaw tightened visibly, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly in a public setting. And what exactly gives you the right to speak on Evelyn's behalf, Your Grace? Forgive me if I find your sudden protectiveness rather convenient, given how quickly you positioned yourself at her side the moment the engagement fell apart. I speak because I have watched Evelyn rebuild her entire life these past months with remarkable courage, Alexander said, his voice steady and unwavering. Something neither of you seem to have noticed, too preoccupied with the damage to your own reputations to recognize the strength it took for her to walk away from a life that offered her everything except genuine happiness. A quiet murmur rippled through the small crowd of guests who had gathered nearby, clearly listening now without pretense. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, uncertain whether the growing attention would help or worsen the situation, but something in Alexander's steady defense gave her the courage to speak again herself, adding her own voice to the moment rather than allowing the two men to simply argue over her as though she were not present. I did not leave that wedding to hurt either of you, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small, tense circle that had formed around them. I left because I finally understood that a life built entirely on obligation and business advantage was not a life I could survive living. I have spent these past months building something different, something built on my own choices, and I do not regret a single moment of that decision, regardless of the cost. Her father stared at her for a long, silent moment, something complicated flickering across his expression, anger still present but tangled now with something that looked almost like reluctant respect. "You have changed," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I have," Evelyn agreed. "I am no longer willing to disappear into whatever role someone else decides I should play." The tense silence stretched between them, the surrounding guests watching with barely concealed curiosity, waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. Finally, her father gave a slow, reluctant nod, something in his rigid posture loosening slightly. "I do not agree with your choice," he said, "but I begin to understand perhaps why you made it." It was not an apology, not quite forgiveness, but it was more than Evelyn had expected, and something in her chest loosened at the small, unexpected acknowledgement. Edmund, meanwhile, remained visibly unsatisfied, his expression tight with lingering frustration, though he said nothing further, clearly recognizing that continuing the argument in front of so many watching guests would only damage his own carefully cultivated reputation further. "This conversation is not entirely finished," Edmund said finally, his voice tight but controlled. "But I see there is little more to be gained from continuing it here tonight." He turned and walked away without further word, disappearing quickly into the crowd, clearly eager to escape the growing attention their confrontation had drawn. Evelyn's father lingered a moment longer, studying her with an expression she could not entirely read, before offering a final, stiff nod and turning to rejoin his business associates across the room. As the small crowd of curious onlookers began to disperse, returning to their own conversations, Evelyn let out a long, shaking breath, the tension of the confrontation finally beginning to release from her shoulders. "You did remarkably well," Alexander said quietly, his hand finding hers gently. "I did not expect it to feel like that," Evelyn admitted. "Frightening, yes, but also somehow freeing. I have spent so many years afraid of exactly this kind of confrontation, and now that it has happened, I find I am still standing, still myself, regardless of what either of them thinks of the choice I made. That is because the choice was always yours to make, Alexander said gently, regardless of their approval. Evelyn looked around the grand ballroom, filled with the same glittering crowd that had once defined every boundary of her old life, and felt, for the first time, entirely unafraid of it. She was no longer the frightened bride who had fled a wedding in a moment of desperate panic. She was a woman who had rebuilt her own life, deliberately and courageously, and tonight, standing beside Alexander in front of everyone who had once expected her to disappear quietly back into obedience, she had proven to herself more than anyone else exactly how far she had come. Spring arrived early that year, warming the countryside around Alexander's estate with soft green growth and long, golden afternoons. Evelyn spent much of the season continuing her quiet work restoring old books in the estate library, a small business she had slowly begun building on her own, taking occasional commissions from other private collectors who had heard, through careful word of mouth, of her growing skill and attention to detail. It was modest work, nothing close to the vast wealth she had once been surrounded by, yet it belonged entirely to her, built from nothing but her own patience and effort, and she treasured it more than she had ever treasured anything handed to her freely in her old life. Her relationship with her father remained distant but no longer entirely broken. They exchanged occasional letters, careful and formal at first, gradually growing slightly warmer as months passed. He had not attended the gala confrontation with any change of heart regarding arranged marriages or business alliances, and Evelyn understood he likely never would. But there existed now, at least, a fragile thread of mutual respect between them, something neither of them had thought possible in the immediate aftermath of that first, dramatic escape. Edmund, for his part, had quietly moved on, his engagement to another young woman from a prominent business family announced only a few months after the gala, the arrangement clearly serving the same practical purposes their own engagement once had. Evelyn felt no bitterness at the news, only a quiet, distant relief that whatever chapter of her life had once been tangled with his ambitions was now fully, peacefully closed. It was on a warm afternoon in early June, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful day she had fled her own wedding, that Alexander suggested they take a drive out to Ashwood Lane, toward the small stone chapel that had, in so many ways, marked the true beginning of everything that followed. The chapel looked much the same as it always had, weathered stone and faded wood standing quietly among the trees, though someone, Evelyn suspected Alexander himself, had recently cleared away the overgrown grass along the path and repaired the small wooden door that had once creaked so loudly on its hinges. "I thought," Alexander said, as they walked together up the familiar path, "that if we were ever going to build something new here, we might as well begin by caring for the place that brought us together in the first place." Evelyn smiled, running her fingers gently along the newly repaired doorframe. "It looks wonderful. My mother would have loved seeing it cared for like this." They stepped inside together, the familiar quiet stillness of the small chapel settling over them exactly as it always had, sunlight filtering softly through the freshly cleaned windows, illuminating the old wooden pews in warm, golden light. Alexander turned to face her near the front of the small altar, and Evelyn felt her heart begin to race, though not with the fear and panic that had once filled her in another chapel, on another day, entirely different from this one. "Evelyn," Alexander said, reaching for her hands gently, "a year ago you walked through that door running from a life that was never truly your own, and somehow, unexpectedly, you found me here, in the one place you had always trusted completely. Every day since then, I have watched you rebuild your life with a courage I admire more than I know how to properly express. I do not wish to offer you another arrangement, another obligation disguised as love. I wish only to ask, honestly and freely, whether you would choose to build a future with me, entirely because you want to, and for no other reason at all." He knelt slowly, producing a simple ring from his coat pocket, far less extravagant than the one Edmund had once placed in her hand, yet somehow far more meaningful for its simplicity, chosen not for appearance or status, but for her alone. Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes, warm and joyful, entirely different from the tears that had once blurred her vision as she ran from another altar a year before. "Yes," she said softly, then again, louder, more certain, laughter mixing with her happy tears. "Yes, Alexander, I choose this. I choose you freely and entirely because I want to." He rose and gently placed the ring on her finger, then pulled her into a warm, steady embrace. The small chapel around them filled with quiet golden light and the soft, distant sound of birds singing in the trees outside. They were married there in that same small chapel, only a few months later, surrounded not by 300 curious guests and careful business partners, but by a small, close gathering of people who genuinely cared for them both, Mrs. Whitfield beaming proudly near the front pew, Charlotte offering approving nods throughout the simple ceremony, and even Evelyn's father standing quietly near the back, present in a way she had once thought impossible, though still careful and reserved in his own manner. As Evelyn stood once again at an altar, this time in a simple, elegant gown of her own choosing, she felt none of the panic and desperation that had once sent her running from another ceremony entirely. Instead, she felt only quiet, steady certainty, standing beside a man who had never once asked her to become anything other than exactly who she already was. When the officiant asked for her vows this time, Evelyn did not hesitate, did not glance toward anyone else for approval or permission. She looked directly into Alexander's warm, steady eyes and spoke the words freely, entirely her own, chosen not out of obligation or family expectation, but out of genuine, hard-won love, built patiently over a year of honesty, courage, and quiet trust. Outside the small chapel windows, the countryside stretched wide and green beneath a clear summer sky, the same quiet fields where Evelyn had once arrived frightened and uncertain, still wearing the remnants of a wedding gown from a life she never truly wanted. Now, standing here again, she understood fully what her mother had always tried to teach her in that same small chapel so many years before, that true safety was never found in the security other people arranged around you, but in the courage to build a life entirely, unapologetically your own. And this time, when she walked back down the narrow aisle as a married woman, she did not run from anything at all. She walked forward, steady and certain, toward everything she had finally chosen for herself. 2 years after their quiet wedding at the small stone chapel, Evelyn stood once again among its familiar walls, though this time for an entirely different reason. What had once been a private, hidden refuge known only to her, and her mother had slowly, carefully become something larger, something she never could have imagined during those first frightened days of her escape. It began simply enough, with a single letter from a young woman named Margaret Fenwick, a stranger who had read about Evelyn's story in the papers years earlier, and finally found the courage to write, explaining her own situation, an arranged engagement she felt trapped inside, with nowhere safe to turn for guidance or support. Evelyn had read the letter 3 times before showing it to Alexander, moved deeply by how closely the young woman's fear mirrored her own, once upon a time. "Perhaps," Alexander had said thoughtfully, "this chapel could become more than simply our own private refuge. Perhaps it could offer that same quiet safety to others who need it just as badly as we once did." The idea grew slowly over the following months, careful and deliberate, exactly the way Evelyn preferred to build anything meaningful in her life. With Alexander's support and her own growing confidence, she established a small, private foundation, offering quiet legal guidance, temporary shelter, and simple emotional support to young women and men trapped within arranged marriages or overwhelming family expectations. Individuals who, like Evelyn once had, needed nothing more than a safe place to gather their courage before making difficult, necessary choices about their own futures. They renovated a small cottage near the chapel grounds, modest and welcoming rather than grand, a place where visitors could stay privately for a few days or weeks, while working through their own complicated family situations with the careful guidance of Margaret Ellery, who had eagerly agreed to offer her legal expertise to the growing effort. Evelyn herself often spent quiet afternoons speaking with the young women who arrived at their door frightened and uncertain, offering them the same steady, patient understanding Alexander had once offered her, without judgment, without pressure, simply present in whatever way was needed. Evelyn's father, surprising her greatly, became one of the Foundation's earliest financial supporters, though he never fully explained his reasons for the sudden generosity. Evelyn suspected, quietly, that some part of him recognized in the young women who passed through their doors a reflection of the daughter he had once nearly lost entirely through his own rigid expectations. And perhaps, in his own careful, distant way, this was his manner of making amends for choices he could never quite bring himself to openly apologize for. Their relationship remained imperfect, still occasionally strained by old habits and old wounds that never fully healed. But Evelyn found herself grateful even for this fragile, evolving connection, so different from the cold distance that had defined their final conversation on her father's front steps that very first difficult day. He visited the estate several times a year now, always slightly stiff and formal in his manner, yet increasingly present in ways Evelyn had once believed impossible. Charlotte, meanwhile, had become one of Evelyn's closest friends, her initial sharp suspicion long since replaced by genuine affection and loyalty. She often joined Evelyn at the cottage, helping welcome new visitors with the same brisk, practical warmth she brought to everything in her life, and teasing her brother relentlessly about how thoroughly Evelyn had transformed his once quiet, solitary existence. As for Alexander, he continued managing his estate with the same steady, thoughtful care he had always shown, though he now spent increasing amounts of time supporting the Foundation's growing work alongside Evelyn, quietly proud of everything she had built from what once began as nothing more than a desperate, frightened escape. One warm afternoon, nearly 3 years after that first fateful meeting in the small stone chapel, Evelyn sat in the cottage garden with a young woman named Isabel, barely 20 years old, who had arrived just days earlier, fleeing an arranged engagement remarkably similar to Evelyn's own. "I do not know how to explain it to my family," Isabel admitted quietly, twisting her hands nervously in her lap. "They will be furious. They have already spent so much preparing everything." Evelyn recognized the fear in the young woman's voice immediately, the same fear that had once driven her sprinting down a cathedral aisle in a wedding gown far too heavy for running. She reached over gently, placing a reassuring hand over Isabel's trembling ones. "You do not owe anyone an explanation for choosing your own honesty," Evelyn said softly, echoing words Alexander had once offered her in that very same chapel, words that had changed the entire course of her life. "Whatever fear you feel right now, whatever anger your family expresses, none of that changes the fact that this is your life, and you alone hold the right to decide how you wish to live it." Isabel looked up at her, tears gathering in her eyes, though something steadier had already begun replacing the earlier panic in her expression. "How did you find the courage to do it, to simply walk away from everything you were expected to become?" Evelyn smiled, glancing toward the small chapel visible just beyond the garden hedge, its weathered stone walls holding within them nearly her entire story, every fear and every triumph that had shaped the woman she had slowly, carefully become. "I did not find courage all at once," she admitted honestly. "I found it slowly, one small choice at a time, beginning with a single moment when I finally understood that I deserved a life built on my own honest wishes, rather than someone else's careful plans." She squeezed Isabel's hands gently, offering the same quiet reassurance she herself had once desperately needed. "You have already taken the hardest first step, simply by arriving here. Whatever comes next, you will not face it alone." As evening settled softly over the garden, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and gold, Evelyn watched Isabel slowly relax, the tight fear in her shoulders easing just slightly beneath the quiet safety of the chapel grounds. It reminded Evelyn powerfully of her own first evening here, years earlier, frightened and uncertain, discovering unexpectedly that the world held more kindness and possibility than her old, carefully controlled life had ever allowed her to imagine. Later that night, after Isabel had retired to the cottage for the evening, Evelyn found Alexander waiting for her near the chapel entrance, exactly where she had first discovered him sitting quietly on that transformative day years before. He smiled warmly as she approached, reaching out to take her hand. "You are remarkable," he said simply, watching her with open admiration. "Watching you offer that same steady comfort to Isabel today, I found myself thinking back to the very first evening we spent together here, and how far you have traveled since then." "We have traveled that distance together," Evelyn corrected gently, leaning into his familiar warmth. "I could never have built any of this without you standing steadily beside me, exactly as you promised you would that very first frightened day." They stood together quietly in the soft evening light, looking out over the small chapel and the modest cottage beyond it, the quiet foundation of safety and honest choice they had built together from nothing but courage and genuine care. What had once been simply a private refuge for a frightened runaway bride had grown into something far greater, a living reminder that true security was never found in carefully arranged plans or protected family names, but in the steady, hard-won courage to choose an honest life, freely and entirely one's own. Evelyn glanced once more toward the chapel doors, weathered and worn yet standing as strong and welcoming as they had that very first day, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude settle over her heart. She had once fled through those doors searching desperately for safety from a life she never wanted. Now, years later, she stood before them offering that very same safety to others. A quiet, powerful reminder that even the most frightening, uncertain beginnings could grow, with enough courage and honest choice, into something entirely beautiful.